Hello and welcome to Real Cheating Story. I didn't want to talk, so I blocked all phone numbers except for family and work. Family meant primarily ISA. For 3 months, I dealt only with ISA and work. When my phone rang, it jarred me awake, my mind felt thick, and my thinking was slow. I groaned as I pushed the phone off the bed and rolled over, clutching a pillow to my ears. The ringing continued on the floor. What time was it? A digital clock on the table showed 3:13. I smiled derisively, thinking of my childhood friend, Jill, always my best friend, my lovely wife, who promised to love me. The ringing stopped, and I relaxed, but it started again. I dropped a pillow on it, but it still clanged. Rolling to the edge of the mattress, I reached down and pulled the pillow off. The screen was lit, ISA. I flopped onto my back. Great. Her sister ISA, pronounced Aya, was probably imagining this conversation in the middle of the night. Kyle, why didn't you answer? Because I drink too much now, it's what I do. I haven't worked, haven't read a book, nothing. I wanted the despair that those statements suggested, but they weren't all true. I'd worked some, checking edits from my editors, talked to my boss Sharon Ackerman, and texted a lot with Murray. I just said I had a personal problem, and they didn't question it. I let out a little more to Murray over the months, so I was sure they both knew what was up. They were workmates and friends. I was still drinking, but only in the evenings to avoid dreams. It didn't work. ISA would sigh and mumble but avoided berating me, probably thinking, but not saying, "Get it together, Kyle." ISA was a bit superior in attitude, mostly because she was superior in many ways that mattered. She was pretty great in every way, always offering understanding. I should hang up or just put it down and roll over, but I didn't know what I'd do. The ringing stopped, thus ending the need for a decision. She rarely called me before the troubles began. Since then, she called every few days. Once, she called to say her parents welcomed me to stay with them until things worked out. The other times, she mentioned that she knew Jill and believed the troubles could be overcome, that love could win. At that, I hung up. Everything with her presupposed reconciliation as a positive eventuality. I wasn't morally opposed to it, but I had to consider divorce as a likely and maybe the best outcome. Life without Jill was something I'd never considered before, not ever. Now, I had 3 months to think about it. Afghanistan felt far away. The phone rang again, and I ignored it until it went away. Perhaps there was a family meeting or Jill demanded a decision on divorce. I imagined ISA drunk or maybe Gil was getting another degree, and we all needed to know immediately. It rang again a few minutes later, persistent. I reached for it, pushed the pillow aside, and saw it again. Of course, I answered to make it stop. "Yeah, hello?" I asked. "Don't screw with me, please." ISA was quiet, unusually quiet. I waited for her anger. I had ignored her, her mom, her dad, and my own feelings since learning the truth about my marriage. Finally, ISA spoke calmly. "Kyle, listen closely. She was killed, Kyle. Jill, in Afghanistan." A sudden hollowness twisted within me. I felt as if I were looking down a tunnel, saying nothing as a torrent of emotions surged: hate, sorrow, loss, and justification. I hadn't realized justification was an emotion, but it piled on top of me. I felt heavy inside. Jill was dead. I cried out, frustrated, angry, and empty. No, I was less than I had just been, and I knew I'd never be so much again. I was sure life could get worse, worse than the worst I'd experienced. ISA was patient, waiting. I breathed into the phone, wishing she were here. Someone to hug, no, not just anyone. I let out a frustrated sigh. "Why do they come so late at night?" I asked. Jill had said they didn't come in the middle of the night. ISA explained they'd been looking for me for 2 days and couldn't reach me. They were worried it would leak out. No one in the 6th Marines could call home until next of kin were notified. They broke a rule coming so late. "I see," I said. "I blocked everyone but work and family. I need some time, please. Call me when you want to talk, Kyle, or when you're sober. I know how you must feel. We're all awake and we'll be here." Call whenever or just come over when you're ready. I heard crying in the background, then ISA's voice breaking as she hung up, as if she had been holding it together and could finally let it go. I'd heard her cry before, but not like this. The line went dead. I put the cell phone down on the table, staring blankly at whatever was before my eyes. I was sobered by the news, but still felt the heavy fog of too much drink for too many days. Memories flooded me, us as kids, climbing trees, playing baseball, skiing knees. I remembered being at Jill and ISA's back door by 9 most mornings. Sometimes I heard Jill calling for me even earlier, my dad too fond of her to scold. Now, a woman I loved was gone. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, sitting at the motel's small table, staring at the steam rising from the cup and sipping it black. I hated it black, but I sipped it that way now. I closed my eyes and saw Jill, running bases, typing, reading at church, studying in the library, hiking, laughing in a restaurant. I remembered her warmth and the connection we had, the fun we shared. The loss felt profound. I had never experienced the death of someone I loved before. Did she die knowing he loved her? Was it acceptable to cry over the loss of a wife who didn't love me back? Now, let's hear the story from ISA Kennison Gilstrap's perspective. Dad and I talked about that night several times. It was the worst night of our lives. 2 Marine officers arrived around 2:30 in the morning. Mom and Dad went to the door together, worried about a late-night visit. Dad said he would open it, and as he unlocked the door, the moment Mom saw them, she fainted. Dad caught her, and it was only a moment before she revived. One Marine helped Dad get her to the couch. "I'm Captain Thomas Sheen, the Casualty Assistance Officer," he began. "This is Lieutenant Mark Smith. I'm sorry, but I must verify your identity. Are you the parents of Major Jill Kennison?" "Yes, Captain," Dad said, holding Mom, who was crying. The captain took a deep breath and continued, "I regret to inform you that Major Jill Kennison, USMC, was killed in action." The words hung heavy in the air. Dad and Mom clung to one another, the silence suffocating. "Sir," the Marine continued after a sympathetic pause, "we have been unable to contact the Major's husband, Kyle Franklin. His cell phone number is out of service, and he hasn't been in his residence aboard Camp Leon." Dad, beginning to function again, said, "I need to call our other daughter. I have to tell her. It was a call I never wanted to remember, so I won't put it here." I was awake, having just spent time with Gil, who was still asleep. I answered the phone on the first ring, scared by the late hour. Dad's voice broke through, and I cried out for Jill. Gil could tell something was wrong and held me as I listened to Dad. "I'll be over soon," I said, surrendering into Gil's embrace. I calmed down in his arms and kissed him before throwing on last night's clothes. My mind flitted from detail to detail. I needed to call Kyle, they couldn't reach him. I had to go to my parents' house. "I'll call him from there," I said. "Marines are here," Dad said, nodding. "I'll keep the girls home. I won't tell them until you're back." He kissed my forehead, and I left. Just a few minutes later, I rushed through the front door of our house and threw myself into Mom and Dad's arms. I noticed the look one Marine gave the other. Men often exchanged looks, especially in times like these, but this one was serious. "Kyle, have you reached him?" Mom asked. Even during these last troubled months, she kept her focus. The captain nodded. "We're not supposed to come so late, but there's been a search in North Carolina with no luck. We didn't want you to find out on the internet." I could see the worry on his face. He felt he'd broken a rule by coming late. Mom and Dad were too devastated to speak, so I chimed in. "I can reach Kyle if he'll answer. I think I know where he's staying." "For now, ma'am," the Marine said, "we're supposed to notify him in person." I shook my head. "He'd rather hear it from me. He won't want us to see him the way he is now." Kyle had been struggling with alcohol. I suspected he'd been drinking again. Looking the captain in the eye, I added, "Kyle's my best friend. I'll make sure he understands." The captain nodded, breaking protocol but acknowledging the situation. I managed to reach Kyle after several tries, while the Marines talked quietly with Mom and Dad in the living room. I heard myself urging Kyle to sober up, which likely raised questions for them, but I hung up and let my tears flow. Mom and Dad joined me, and we all cried together. The captain and lieutenant waited patiently for us to settle down. They shared the details about Jill's death. She had died in an explosion during a grenade attack on her vehicle. They would need to talk to Kyle in a day or so about the funeral and other arrangements. I gave them my number, assuring them I could usually reach Kyle if no one else could. The captain wrote notes, and I made coffee, serving it black to everyone since none of us wanted to leave the room for cream or sugar. We shared stories. Dad remembered a time Jill avoided a tag to score a run while playing baseball with Kyle. Mom recalled how she cried after being stung by bees as a child. As gentle memories filled the room, the Marines eventually stood to leave. "Ladies and sir, we will be in contact soon. You may call me any time," the captain said, handing a card to Dad and two to me. "Please have Mr. Franklin contact me soon." After they left, we sat in silence, still grappling with the reality of Jill's death. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Kyle. I stepped forward and hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his arms around me, something we rarely did. Mom and Dad waited in the room while we whispered our disbelief. "I can't believe this," he said. "I know," I replied, squeezing him tighter. "It will never be the same." We finally walked into the room where Mom hugged Kyle, whispering her comfort, followed by Dad, who offered a more brief embrace and handshake. "We should sit," Mom said. "The Marines left a while ago." "I'll get some coffee," Kyle said. He returned with his cup and settled next to Mom on the couch. Dad mentioned that we had been sharing stories about Jill, and the room grew quiet for a moment, with Mom softly crying. I decided to tell the story of the day Jill announced she wanted to join the Marines. I recalled how she had asked Dad to sit at the table with her, wanting to make her case. She was a senior in high school, and I was home from Dayton, I explained, smiling at the memory. Jill was determined to make her case to Dad. "Dad, I want you to listen," she said, her nerves apparent. I noticed Dad glancing at her left hand, probably wondering if she was engaged. I smiled. That wouldn't have surprised us. "Okay, shoot," he said. "I want to join the Marines." She had never voiced this to Mom or Dad, but every kid in the neighborhood had known for years. "You want what?" Dad asked, surprised. It wasn't really a question. Kyle and Jill rarely discussed their dreams with adults, but she was open with her peers. We'd talked before about how the women Marines' dress uniforms were a bit dorky, yet she brought up the Marines frequently in high school. "I want to join ROTC, she said. "I think I can get a scholarship. My scores are high." "You were in the Marines, and so was Grandpa. Why can't a woman want to be in the Marines?" The term woman felt a bit strange coming from a high school senior. Dad exhaled, clearly leaping to the conclusion that she meant college and enlisting. He was obviously relieved to hear the words scholarship and ROTC. He took his time responding, as he often did. "What about Kyle? You must be serious. What does he think?" "We're serious. We've talked about getting married, and we'll get engaged when I'm in college." "No, I mean, how will your being in the service affect him?" Dad didn't know much about Kyle's hopes. He was studying English composition and American history, but he rarely discussed his career aspirations. Kyle was gaining recognition from his teachers at Miami, winning writing contests, but he didn't boast about it. That was Jill's territory. "He's willing to go where I'm stationed. He thinks we may have to be apart some, but that goes for any military family. He's a good guy," she said. "He expects to work from home in publishing, that's what he hopes, anyway." I thought she sounded positive and capable. She told me she had scripted everything out ahead of time, classic Jill. Dad looked thoughtful. "You love Kyle, don't you?" It seemed odd to ask, everyone knew they belonged together. "Yes, I love Kyle, but I want to do this too. No one will come between us. Kyle is part of me. If he's unhappy, then we'll decide what to do together, even if it means I leave the Marines. He thinks being a civilian will make our relationship easier. He's flexible." Two kids with limited life experience wanted to dive into the world. I almost laughed. Jill was meticulous and dedicated to everything she undertook. I had no doubt she would find success. Dad considered for a moment. He has to come first, you know? You both need to decide together what's best for your marriage and family. Jill nodded. I know. I have to be reasonable about the family, just as he's being reasonable about the Marines. We've talked about it, and we think we can work it all out. You know how positive Kyle is. Dad acknowledged this, looking at me. Has she been thinking about this for a long time? He placed his hand on Jill's, and she knew he supported her. I nodded and smiled. Remember when we played soldier? She always insisted we call it playing Marines. Yeah, she's wanted to do this for a long time. Forever, really. Dad nodded, looking Jill in the eye. Your mom thought you'd want to do something like this. I'll tell her when she gets home from choir tonight. Jill's eyes sparkled. Dad, I'm so grateful, she said, leaning over the table to hug him. We sat quietly for a moment, remembering that difficult morning. Kyle recalled their adventures together, climbing Mount Fuji when he visited her in Okinawa, flying to Tokyo for a few days, and enduring a cockroach infestation at Camp Lejeune, where they were afraid to turn on the lights. He spoke about swimming in a creek in North Carolina's Uhuru National Forest and his promotion to chief editor at his company. Each memory was bittersweet, a reminder of a part of Jill's life we didn't fully know, now shadowed by loss. Marge, the regimental commander's wife, had sent me an updated list of the officers' families. There shouldn't be any more officer transfers by early April, Dwight insisted. I had their addresses and contact information, ready to reach out to the battalion commanders' spouses. I was surprised to hear there was a woman in the regiment. She's in accounting, just made major a year early, I believe. Jill Kennison, Dwight said, abruptly cutting off the conversation. She didn't take his last name. I looked at the list. Kyle Franklin? I hadn't known Dwight had a woman Marine assigned, especially one with a higher rank. Her specialty wasn't combat arms, but she had been working with him in logistics for some time. I'll organize something. Just give me a date, and I'll reach out to the battalion officers' wives to see how they can help, I offered. I enjoyed seeing the families come together, even though I had decided against having children myself. Dwight smiled. You'll be the one they look to now. I know it's not an official role, but it's appreciated. I don't mind. It makes things a little more bearable. It's easy to feel alone, I said. Dwight mentioned the upcoming meeting with his battalion commanders. They're nervous about the deployment. Henry from 3rd Battalion can't sleep since his wife left him. I remembered meeting Lily Henry briefly. She had taken the kids back to Pennsylvania, but I didn't know the details. It's a lot of stress being a Marine officer's spouse, I acknowledged. I decided I'd call Major Kennison's husband to get a sense of what his life was like. I think I will, I said, considering how different it might be for a husband during deployment. Go ahead, Dwight encouraged. As we finished dinner, Dwight pressed his uniform for the next day. I went upstairs to find something nice to wear, hoping to impress him. When I returned, he seemed distant. I'm here if you want me, I said, aware that he had been less enthusiastic lately. Typically, as his unit ramped up for deployment, he would want to be intimate every day, sometimes even twice. We shared a laugh about it, recalling how before his last deployment, I'd often find ways to surprise him. You look great, he said, but he seemed distracted. Tomorrow night, I promise. You know, Tuesdays can feel so long, he said. I tried not to be disappointed, but I missed him. Isa Gilstrap, sister of Major Jill Kennison, narrated the moment. They weren't divorced, there had just been no time. Pal discovered Jill's infidelity a week before her deployment. He was my friend, my brother-in-law, my buddy. I would have loved him even if Jill hadn't come along. They were that couple everyone thought belonged together. If ever two were destined, it was they. An affair was not just unlikely, it felt impossible. But Kyle was struggling. I saw the light fade from his eyes as he sank into a deep sadness, much like the end of the second Terminator movie, where the Terminator descends into molten metal. That was Kyle at our kitchen table that evening. His descent wasn't self-sacrifice, but rather a martyrdom to commitment. He never imagined she would hurt him like that, none of us did. I didn't know such pain existed, and I wasn't even the one most affected. When Jill and Kyle flew into town for a pre-deployment leave, Mom, Dad, and I met them on the porch as they carried their bags from the rental car. Gil was on the phone and would meet them inside. "Mom, Dad!" Jill exclaimed, rushing to hug each of them, then turning to me. "ISA, you're so thin," she said, looking me over. "I have kids and work hard to stay slim," Kyle added, flashing his charming smile. "It's so good to be home." He hugged Mom and shook Dad's hand like it was the most natural thing, as it had always been. Kyle had called our parents Mom and Dad since 4th grade, and it was never a joke or a competition. We hardly noticed when he hugged me finally, stirring feelings I had never admitted to anyone, not even to Gil. We went inside, and over the next 2 hours, around 20 old friends stopped by to talk, laugh, and reminisce. There were new babies to see, stories to share, and old friends to commiserate with. We avoided the topic of war. No one wanted to think of Jill in danger. Some conversations were lighthearted, others reflected on how it was easier to reach Jill to relay messages to Kyle than to call him directly. Kyle just smiled. I didn't think he liked cell phones much. About 2 hours later, the terrible revelation came. The guests had departed, the food was put away, and the dishes were either in the dishwasher or the sink. Gil left to round up our girls from a friend's house. We were sitting around the table, Dad and Kyle drinking Bud Seltzer, while Mom and I had water. Mom and Dad were on one side, and Jill, Kyle, and I on the other. When Jill excused herself to the bathroom, Kyle mentioned a new opportunity he had with a publishing house and said he would talk to Jill about it soon. Then her phone rang, right in front of Kyle, displaying the name and rank of the regimental commander. Kyle casually pushed a button while finishing his sentence to Mom and Dad, and then a text popped up, "Missing you already. Can't forget Tuesday evening. Hope you're not sore. Come back early and I'll make it worth your while." Kyle smiled initially, but then his expression shifted. The message was jarringly suggestive, and he quickly became serious. I read it from beside him and gasped. "It might have been an accident," he muttered, "just for me to hear." "Looks like enough for a search warrant," he added, his voice tense. I could sense his struggle, whether to respect her privacy or seek the truth that we both suspected and feared. After a moment of silence, he looked me in the eyes and said, "I have to know." There was a calm determination in his voice. Mom and Dad must have been puzzled by our sudden private conversation. They couldn't see the screen from across the table. Kyle paged through Jill's messages and found several suggestive texts from Colonel Dwight Deo. I put my hand on his arm, but I couldn't speak. It felt like a betrayal of everything I valued about my sister. Kyle switched to the sent messages and saw that Jill had suggested intimate encounters and expressed longing in a way that felt wholly out of character for her. I squeezed his arm tightly, feeling tears escape my eyes. Just then, Jill returned, and Kyle was still reading a message that day where she hoped they would be able to meet in the war zone. Seeing my hands around Kyle's arm and the tears on my face, Jill sensed the change in atmosphere. "Ah, here it is," Kyle said, finding the off button and silencing the phone. He stood up and handed it to her, saying, "Colonel Deo texted, asking if you might return early." He looked at Jill with a calm demeanor, though the tension in the room was palpable. Kyle turned to Mom and Dad, speaking formally, thanking them for the wonderful homecoming. His tone was serious, and I noticed he didn't allow anyone else to speak. "I'm afraid I can't stay here now, ISA, he said, looking at me. I could see the struggle in his eyes, a plea for understanding. I nodded slightly, realizing our lives would never be the same. He glanced at Jill one last time, and I saw sadness in his eyes and confusion in hers. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, but then he dropped his hand and left. Without hesitation, he grabbed 2 of their bags and walked out the door, his exit swift and resolute. I looked at my sister, who seemed both mystified and angry. In that moment, I felt a surge of resentment. She had been his first priority for so long, and now it was clear that the feeling wasn't mutual. "He read your text to your colonel," I said, looking at Mom and Dad. "She's having an affair." Mom jumped up in disbelief, her chair crashing to the floor as her hands flew to her face in shock. Jill cried out and tried to get around the table, but Mom's chair blocked her way to the door, and Kyle's chair blocked the other. By the time Jill made it into the living room and opened the door, Kyle was already backing out of the driveway. "Kyle! Kyle," she called, recalling how she used to call his name at the back door early on so many mornings. This time, he didn't respond. Her voice held a lament as she realized he was leaving, and the sound of her crying was heart-wrenching. She watched the rental car turn down the street and disappear around the bend, her calls growing more desperate as hope faded. After a moment, she turned back, finding her parents and a sibling who felt almost as cheated as her husband. Looking at me, she asked, "Why did he open my phone?" She had assumed that his respect for her would protect her from discovery. "Your lover texted. I think he meant to turn it off, but he accidentally opened it instead. Then he had to know." I noticed her eyes flicker when I said lover. At least she felt some remorse. I stood up, unable to contain my emotions. "How could you?" I asked, my voice rising in fury. I had never spoken to her with this depth of anger before. Looking at her, I saw her lower her gaze, shaking her head as she sat down. "We've been his family since he was 6. He has no one else. He was always with us, one of us." I was shouting now. "He was like a brother. How could you cheat him like this? We were supposed to be a family. How can we be a family now with this?" The room fell silent. Jill's face was locked in a stony expression, and Mom was leaning against Dad, both lost in thought. I wiped tears from my cheeks as Dad finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We watched the 3 of you grow up. It was joyous, one of the best parts of our lives." He looked at Mom, who nodded in agreement. "We thought we taught you character and dedication. We thought virtue was part of our family." He shook his head with a bittersweet smile, recalling lost optimism. "If ever 2 were 1, it was you 2. Never did that boy consider loving someone other than you. He missed you so much when you were away, living mostly alone and waiting for you to come back. He was absolutely crushed by your miscarriage." Jill nodded, realizing the truth in his words. Dad was visibly struggling to maintain his composure, holding Mom tightly. "I'm so sorry," Jill whispered, her voice small. Dad continued, "You Marines make a big production of your motto, but you cheated the person most loyal to you. You don't choose when to be virtuous." Jill seemed to absorb his words, her expression shifting as if a light had turned on. Mom remained calm, resting her head on Dad's shoulder in an unusual display of affection. "It was pride," Mom said, her voice trembling. "I was too proud." We sat in difficult silence, feeling the weight of loss. Our family had lost its innocence. Mom believed that her efforts to be a good mother had failed. She felt that her daughter's choices reflected poorly on her. "I'll never give advice to another mother again," she said, looking at me. Jill's face registered shock, and she eventually left the table without a word, retreating to her old room. She slept in her travel clothes, avoiding the confrontation of facing any of us. Later, Mom and I discussed the situation while Dad listened quietly, trying to calm down. We wondered if Kyle would ever feel part of our family again or if he would pull away completely. I remembered I had to work in the morning, so I went home and told Gil. He shook his head, disbelief evident on his face. "It's hard to believe," he said finally, hugging me as he considered the ramifications. "Kyle will never be the same again." Gil was close to Kyle, perhaps not as close as I was, but still very close for 2 such different people. "Nothing will ever be the same again," I echoed, and Gil accepted the sentiment. I feared Kyle would sink into depression for a while. It was hard to imagine him happy without Jill. She had always seemed to be the source of his joy. I hoped he would navigate the darkness and eventually rise again, perhaps to be the kind of man who could find happiness even without the great love of his life. No one spoke to Jill much during her leave. It felt as if a pall had settled over us, making every word or movement feel like too much effort. I escaped to my home, where Gil and our children were. We explained to the kids that Aunt Jill was home, but Uncle Kyle had to leave unexpectedly. They were used to seeing Kyle and Jill come and go. Jill stayed for the entirety of her leave, perhaps hoping Kyle would talk to her. Several times, I saw her in tears. Once, she sat with me in the living room, saying, "Mom, talk to me." I asked her how that went, and she looked at me, her eyes filled with emotion. How could anyone not love Kyle enough to be faithful to him? I was at a loss for words. I don't know, I finally replied. Mom entered, sensing the tension. Oh, Jill, you're still protecting your affair, she said gently, but Jill got up and left the room, shaking her head, as if in denial. I didn't say anything, feeling a mix of confusion and frustration. Mom often applied her wisdom to our family dynamics, using her intelligence to navigate love and selflessness. I could see Jill was starting to grasp that. Jill tried to call Kyle almost every day. He answered, but wouldn't say much. During her last attempt, I was with her in the kitchen. She stood by the table, phone in hand. Come home, Kyle, she pleaded. I need to explain. She listened intently, but after a moment, shrugged her shoulders. I'm so sorry, Kyle. So sorry, she said before hanging up. I didn't speak immediately, watching her lower the phone to the table, her shoulders slumping. She sat down, burying her face in her hands. I don't know what to do, she murmured. Dad entered, sitting heavily at the table. He looked older than before. Jill looked to him for guidance. I don't know what to do. I've wrecked the most important relationship of my life, she admitted. Dad shook his head, taking a thoughtful pause. Really? You don't know what to do? Your mother has been here for you every day of your life, and you can't think of what to do now. You've made a big mistake. He fixed his gaze on her. You know exactly what to do if you're strong enough. Do what a good woman would do after damaging the love of her life. Do what's right. Do you all hate me? Jill asked, her voice trembling. Dad didn't hesitate. No. Haven't you figured out how love works? You had all of us, Kyle. Your life isn't over, and hopefully his isn't either. I doubt you can make this up to him, but living well from now on might give you the best chance at happiness. I reflected on how Jill was in Afghanistan about 3 months later when she died. I wondered if she had been with Colonel Deo during those months, if their affair continued in secret, or if he was just another part of her life there. From what I gathered, Jill worked in a forward operating base, handling logistics rather than engaging in combat directly. She faced dangers like rocket-propelled grenades and ambushes. I assumed the colonel was stationed there too. Did they keep their affair going under the radar? Were other officers aware, turning a blind eye, perhaps even feeling envy over the colonel's connection with her? I recalled my brief encounter with Deo before her deployment. It started with a phone call from his wife. Hello, Kyle Franklin, a woman's voice said. This is Marge Deo, Colonel Deo's wife. Your wife, Jill, works in his headquarters. Yes, Mrs. Deo. Actually, you're the only husband of a woman in the regiment, Marge Deo said when she called. We had a lengthy conversation, and I got the impression she was genuinely invested in her husband's success. I assured her I'd be staying on base for most of the deployment, with just a couple of commitments, but I'd be accessible by email or phone. I hope you'll come to the officers' family gathering later this month, she said. It'll be a chance to meet Ike and some of the men your wife works with. It's the week before pre-deployment leave. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. The gathering was informal, with officers and their families coming together beneath a pavilion on a warm Saturday afternoon in April. Kids were playing on the playground, and hot dogs and drinks were plentiful, while most Marines were dressed in their desert camis. Jill and I wandered around, meeting some of her colleagues until we came to Mrs. Deo. Mrs. Deo, I'm Jill Kennison. I work in your husband's headquarters, Jill introduced herself. They shook hands, and Marge smiled warmly. Call me Marge. It's so good to finally meet you. As the colonel looked over, he stared at me for a moment before extending his hand. Mr. Franklin, he said, gripping my hand firmly. Good to meet you. I'm glad to have Major Kennison in the regiment. She runs her group like a top, she's been a great addition. His expression shifted, as if assessing me without much enthusiasm. He was significantly taller than I was, and I felt a bit out of place. Thanks, she's great, I managed to say, and Jill playfully punched me in the arm. Marge continued, you can always call me if you have questions, Kyle. I'll send you a list of numbers as the deployment progresses. Are you planning any family gatherings during the deployment? I missed one back in February, I asked. Oh, you're going to school? She replied. I teach occasionally at writing workshops. I was at Wake Forest that week, I explained. That's great, Jill chimed in. Kyle's an editor, he works for various book publishers. I noticed the colonel glanced at me differently, as if considering my role in this world. Yes, as for gatherings, just informal ones. I'll keep you posted, Marge said, turning to greet another couple. The colonel said, I need to speak with you after this, Major. Better yet, I'll just text you. Yes, sir, Jill replied. As others awaited the colonel's attention, we made our polite exit. What did you think? Jill asked. I think he crushed my hand, I said, flexing it. She laughed. Yeah, he's famous for that. The enlisted men call him Iron Ike. He can come off as arrogant, but you have to respect a commander who knows what he's doing. I nodded, and we chatted with some company commanders and their families, who were closer to our age. The gathering was pleasant, filled with kids running around, but during my 3-month withdrawal from society, I often found myself reflecting on that picnic, wondering if there had been any signs of Jill and Deo's affair. Did anyone roll their eyes at me? Did they know what was happening behind the scenes? I received 4 emails from Jill during her deployment. They were carefully worded, knowing a censor might intercept them. The first was a detailed account of her affair, names omitted, and it gave me a jolt when I read it. It mentioned that the affair started shortly after she met Deo. Suddenly, the whole situation felt even more sinister as I considered the implications. The letter concluded with her stating that she no longer spoke to the colonel except for work-related matters. I told him our affair was over, she wrote. I didn't explain why, but I expect him to leave it alone. He doesn't know you discovered it, nor that we're separated. I'm doing my best to confront what I did and face this war. I want to hold my head high around my parents again, maybe someday. The second email was an apology and a plea for me to consider saving our marriage. Jill expressed her feelings for me, her regrets, and her realization that her relationship with Deo was purely physical. She reassured me that he had no intention of leaving his wife and that she didn't want to risk our marriage either. Perhaps the environment of the Marines had influenced her behavior, as it did with others. The third and fourth emails were brief. Jill shared updates about her job and the dangers she faced, ending each with affirmations of love for me and hope that our relationship could still be salvaged. The final letter conveyed her doubt about whether we could ever regain the closeness we once had, acknowledging it was her fault but still believing we could find something meaningful together. As I read her messages, I felt a mix of anger toward her, him, the Marines, and the war. The idea of loving Jill again seemed unappealing. I couldn't shake the thought of her with other Marines. How had she managed to remain faithful during her time away? When we were together, we had used a diaphragm for birth control. When she became pregnant, I had assumed it was simply bad luck. At a restaurant, she told me she was feeling emotional, and I attributed her tears to the surprise of pregnancy. She was pleased about it but expressed regret about missing her deployment, which I assumed was due to hormones affecting her mood. Over the next few days, she continued to cry for seemingly no reason. At 8 weeks, she informed her colonel about her pregnancy and began planning to leave her position, knowing majors weren't deployed to combat zones. However, during a temporary assignment in California, she miscarried in the 7th week while teaching a seminar at Camp Pendleton. Facing this alone was difficult for her, and she called me to say she felt unwell. I wished I could have been there for her during such a personal crisis. After the procedure, I felt a mix of sadness and pride in her strength. One miscarriage felt like unfortunate luck. I thought we would move forward. Yet, every memory now felt tainted with doubt. Was the baby truly mine? Had she been unfaithful early on? I couldn't recall when she first mentioned her affair, and the details in her memoir didn't clarify the timeline. I counted back the weeks, questioning everything about her pregnancy. I thought of her with Deo and knew I would always feel inferior in her mind with the news of her death. That morning over coffee and reminiscences, I drifted into melancholy. The Kennison family went back to bed, and ISA went home to tell her daughters that Aunt Jill was gone. I stayed on the couch, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. Disconnected memories surfaced unbidden. I remembered her diving for grounders, throwing to first, and tagging a runner at the plate. I recalled the day she slid her mom's car into a parked vehicle on an icy morning, fresh out of driver's training, and how she rested her head on my shoulder when my grandma died, letting me cry. I remembered her joy when I handed her the diamond ring when we got engaged, even though it was too small for her finger. As she turned 18, our relationship deepened, and I cherished the warmth of those early moments together. I thought we would last forever. I lay on the couch, pondering, unable to sleep. I would need to sell her car and donate her clothes. I would leave Camp Lejeune and find a place for myself, probably move to Columbus to be near the Zinger offices. I had accepted their job offer, and my role would change in September or October. Suddenly, I remembered I had a business to run. I sat up and grabbed my phone. Murray needed to know. I sent her a text. Emo Jill was killed a few days ago in Afghanistan. Everything's an emotional uproar on top of, you know. Could you let Sharon know? Thanks so much, you're a peach. I had dumped a lot of work on Murray those past 3 months, and now this. In seconds, I had a reply. Oh no, so sorry, Kyle. Call anytime. I'll reach Sharon. Jill's mother, narrating. Jill and I weren't just a couple, we were a shared identity. Our marriage confirmed we were better together than apart. Now, with Jill gone, that connection was shattered. Kay arrived around 6:30 that morning. He knocked on the door, and ISA jumped up to let him in. He could have walked in since the door was unlocked, but after learning of her affair, he changed it. It broke my heart to see him there. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness. ISA and Kay hugged for a long time at the door, whispering to each other. Dan and I let them have their moment. Kay looked so sad, clean-shaven but with dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were rumpled but clean. They finally walked into the living room, ISA's hand in his. I hugged him for a long time. Dan came over and placed his hand on Kay's shoulder. Kay cried mostly silent tears. She loved you, Kyle. I have no doubt. No matter the mistakes she made, she died loving you. He just nodded, pouring himself coffee and joining us on the couch. Dan and I held hands, staring for a while, wishing it weren't so. ISA sat in a chair, sipping her coffee. We shared stories and remembered Jill, reflecting on the kids growing up. I think Jill would have loved running with us as children. Kay smiled at the thought, and ISA laughed at the idea of the little round guy always tagging along in our games. Jill was fun, she broke stereotypes. She enjoyed everything social but wasn't particularly athletic. He claimed he was always a year or so ahead of his peers in school, which left him feeling excluded. I was always tagged first in every game, but when it came to women, he was initially doubtful and then grateful for ISA, who had actually asked him out for their first date. He probably thought he had no chance with her before that. I remembered a moment in the kitchen before their engagement when Gil had asked her, "What do you see in me?" He sounded incredulous, and it broke my heart to hear his vulnerability. ISA stood up, wrapping her arms around him, saying, "It's no mystery, you're the smartest, kindest man I've ever known." Gil stared at her, realizing she meant it, and they shared a long, heartfelt kiss right in front of Dan and me. "Yeah," I said, letting that memory linger. "You had every kid in town cutting through our yards. Why not Gil, too?" Kyle looked over, and I could see he was reflecting. "I always meant to apologize for running through your flowers, but ISA was about to tag me," I laughed, recalling that day. "Jill was so proud of you, Kyle," Dan said, mentioning the promotion to editor. "She called us just to tell us." Kyle looked surprised. "I didn't know she called you." Heads nodded in agreement. We had some good times. Kyle seemed to be looking on the bright side, and I hoped his optimism was returning. They had been such a wonderful couple, filled with so many happy moments. Later that afternoon, ISA and Gil brought the girls over. We'd all napped, and after ISA had returned home to tell the girls the news, their car pulled up. Kyle and I went out to the porch to meet them. I held onto Kyle's arm. It just felt right to include him in that moment. The girls walked up, hugging Kyle, whom they hadn't seen in months, and then me. They went inside, their eyes red from crying. Gil came up the steps, holding ISA's hand before letting go to grasp Kyle's. "How you doing, bud?" Gil asked. Kyle said nothing, overwhelmed again, shaking his head. "You're one of us always, you know," Gil said, a familiar phrase that carried different meanings at different times. This time, it meant he shared in the tough emotions of the day. He hugged me, saying, "It's a sad and awful day." Kyle and Gil were fast friends, exceptional in their own ways and complementary. Each brought people together. Kyle had lost some competitiveness with Gil because he enjoyed being with him, while Gil gained a less nerdy but still intellectual friend. They hardly noticed that Kyle could easily beat Gil in tennis or that Gil could take Kyle's money in poker. They still played both games occasionally. In tennis, Kay might not remember the score, but for him, it was more about the fun of keeping a volley going than winning points. In poker, they agreed no money would ever change hands during their college years. Kyle asked Gil to be his best man, saying, "I have to find a way to get you in the pictures." I remembered ISA and Jill discussing it once when they were home before Jill's trip to Okinawa. We were at the park, watching them finish a tennis match before heading to lunch. "Look at them, they just play and play, not caring who wins," Jill remarked. ISA nodded in agreement, adding, "It's different with Gil, it's like he's finally found someone who understands him." Jill and ISA were smiling, clearly proud of their achievements. "You know," I added, "we're very proud of the boys you girls married." It was just a few months later that Gil was recognized again for his work on the Gilstrapian vector permutations, which he published while at Chapel Hill. UNC awarded him for it, and I learned that engineering firms often hired him under his company name, bringing in a good income. I didn't know there were freelance mathematicians, but Gil seemed to thrive in that environment and was usually available to help with the girls. Kyle also found work through the internet, contracting for public projects. He was a bit harder to figure out, often mentioning his coworkers Sharon, Nelson, and especially M.O. By his late 20s, he was working directly under the company president. "She's preparing me to run the company in a few years," he said. While Jill and Kyle weren't struggling financially, they didn't seem rich either. Being a book editor for a small company provided enough for now. ISA pointed out some articles Kyle had written in magazines, including one about To Kill a Mockingbird. I hadn't realized how deeply he connected with that book. He had become an intellectual in the publishing and critical worlds, and Kyle took pride in being Gil's brother-in-law. There was a mutual respect between them, and Gil loved being around the table with all of us, especially now that his girls were included. Gil was used to being left out, often considered too nerdy or intellectual, but in our family, he was welcomed. Thanks to ISA and Kyle, our family was richer. Kyle brought competitiveness and a sense of brotherhood, though he had struggled with a deep-seated insecurity stemming from his complicated family background. I sensed that he lacked confidence in himself. I thought Jill saw it, and I knew ISA did. We had spoken about it before and after their marriage. ISA viewed it not as a flaw but as part of what made him good. I wished I had discussed it openly with Jill. Kyle was compassionate and sensitive in a way that was rare. He was tough and determined, but he had an ability to feel deeply. He cried openly when Jill was in crisis, expressing guilt for not being there for her. Dan and I were moved as we talked about how loving Kyle was toward Jill. Most of his decisions were made with her best interests in mind: where to live, what car to buy, what would benefit her career. She recognized his regard and always acted in love toward him. When he discovered the affair, he fell apart, perhaps blaming himself for not being a good enough husband. He was quiet for the months Jill was deployed, and ISA worried about him drinking or seeking comfort in the wrong places. I shared my concerns, but ISA shrugged them off. I didn't understand why Jill had the affair. Her moral failure weighed heavily on me as a mother. I wanted my children to be the good ones in every situation. That day we learned of Jill's death, I welcomed my grandchildren into our home. Their eyes were red, and they seemed lost. I kissed my surviving daughter, Malin, who was struggling with the news. I was trying to reach my first ex, Tom Franklin. "Malin, I know that voice anywhere," Thomas said, his tone reflecting his annoyance at me calling him by his full name. He hadn't heard from me since Kyle's wedding, so I pressed on. "Tom, I have some bad news," I said, sensing his quietness. For him, that usually meant he was either asleep or distracted. It's about Kyle's wife, Jill. She was killed while serving with the Marines. Oh no, he responded. I knew that would capture his attention. He might struggle with mundane matters, but he'd wake up to the tragedy of someone he knew. He and I had watched Kyle play with Jill and her sister while they were growing up. After our divorce, I had custody of Kyle and stayed in Sky Gray with him, but my mom really raised him. I moved away for work and remarriage, believing that his friends were the most stable part of his life. When Mom volunteered to care for him, it felt like the right decision. I had never seen Kyle without Jill or her taller sister by his side, and the Kennisons treated him like family too. How's Kyle handling it? Tom asked, a more appropriate question than he might have come up with on his own. He was calm on the phone. She and he were separated, but I don't know the details. He'll get back to us when he knows more, probably in a few days. I always liked Jill, he said, recalling a moment from their past. Remember when she saw me that one time, not in my boxers? He chuckled sadly, thinking back to that morning in the kitchen. There was a catch in his voice as he mentioned her, a moment of vulnerability that reminded me why I valued our friendship. Why didn't he call me himself? Tom asked once he regained his composure. His number for you is old. I got this one from your girlfriend, the one you brought to the wedding. Bri Lynn, right? Yes, I remember her. There was a pause as Tom reflected. I remember Jill waking me up, calling his name so many mornings. She was a good kid. He hesitated. We didn't have much of a marriage, he started, but then trailed off. Yeah, but Kyle came out of it well, and Jill was a sweet girl. I'll give him your number. Do you have a pin? I had only experienced one death before, during my sophomore year in college. Grandma? I called out as I came home from Miami that Friday. Grandma always knew when I was coming and would have cookies and milk or coffee ready. She made it a point to be there, and we would talk at the kitchen table about school, Jill, or family. That day, I noticed something was off when she didn't answer. Grandma? It was unusual for her to be quiet. She was one of those older ladies who ruled her home. I found her sprawled on the kitchen floor. Grandma, come on. I called out, knowing she couldn't hear. I wasn't panicking. Deep down, I knew it was too late. Her eyes were open, but there was no movement, no breath. I knelt beside her. She was cold to the touch. I kissed her forehead, but it felt too cold. Oh, Grandma, I said softly, sitting beside her with my hand on her hair. It took a moment for me to gather myself. I called Mom, and once she understood the situation, she guided me on what to do. I called 911, telling the operator that Grandma was gone. She instructed me to stay on the line until help arrived. I opened the front door, letting the cold air in, and returned to Grandma, stroking her hair gently. It was only a few minutes before I heard the sirens. Police, someone called. I let them in, and an officer found us, her expression softening when she saw Grandma. I found her like this, I said, kissing Grandma's forehead one last time before stepping back. I called Jill, who was walking home from high school. Her parents arrived just as I hung up, having seen the police car. The paramedics came next, and soon Jill joined us on the front porch, where we sat in the winter sun. Words were unnecessary. I cried with Jill's head on my shoulder. Grandma had left me her savings, her house, and her rarely used car. I wasn't wealthy, but suddenly I could pay off student loans and afford graduate school. I would have given it all away to have Grandma back. She had raised me more than my mom had. Since Jill was 2 years younger and I didn't have a pressing job prospect as I finished my bachelor's in English, I enrolled in a master's program at a unique graduate school in Cincinnati. I completed the program in 18 months, taking advantage of Jill's summer Marine training to focus on my studies. 5 months before she graduated, I had a master's degree in literature. We were swept up in wedding preparations and future plans, embracing our love for each other. It was the first thing anyone noticed about us. We didn't hide it. The only private moments we shared were the wonderful ones just between us. Jill graduated with a degree in accounting and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps Reserve. We married and moved into Grandma's house for a month before she relocated to Quantico. I stayed in Ohio for another week, arranging the sale of Grandma's house to the same officer who had responded to my call. Eventually, I joined Jill in Dumfries, Virginia. We made the Marine Corps work for us. Jill attended the basic school for new Marine officers during her first year, followed by specialized training in her field. During that time, I focused on writing workshops and seminars. One late autumn workshop at Duke turned out to be pivotal for my career. In the third week of the 6-week workshop, I was approached by the director, Dr. Sharon Ackerman, whose impressive resume included work with various book publishers. She asked to meet me at Starbucks one morning in Durham. "Your paper on To Kill a Mockingbird is generating some interest among the instructors," she said. "Barnum wants to publish it next month." I was surprised, fearing my introductory essay titled Mockingbird and a Child's Heart was overly simplistic. "It's not just a retelling," she explained. "It offers a fresh perspective that hasn't been considered before. In this business, that's rare." I felt defensive, unsure why she had singled me out for a meeting. "I haven't heard of other students being asked to breakfast," I remarked. She smiled, understanding my caution. "When you put your work out there, it can feel like you're inviting criticism from all corners, especially from anonymous voices. But I'd like to invite you to the spring symposium at Wake Forest to lead some discussions." As she sipped her drink, I realized she was offering me a position. "You're asking me to be an instructor?" I asked, incredulous. "Yes, with guidance. You'll be my assistant, evaluating small groups and presenting ideas from your Mockingbird paper. We've been impressed with your insights into Miss Malone's short story and Mr. Kudnick's essay on James Jones. Does it pay?" I asked, considering my finances. I was living in a dorm at Duke during the week and commuting back to Dumfries every weekend to see Jill. "Yes, not much, but it's an opportunity. I hope you might join us in a new venture as well. We can discuss that later." I nodded, excited. "I have a master's in literature from Union Institute in Cincinnati," I added. She seemed pleased. "I know Union, not exactly mainstream. I may have a position for you if all goes well. You'd work from home, with occasional travel. My wife's a second lieutenant in the Marines. She'll be stationed at Camp Lejeune after Quantico," I mentioned. "Hard on you," she replied. "My husband was in the Navy after med school for 6 years. Any kids?" "No, we're waiting until she's in her 30s. After finishing my coffee, I realized I was genuinely looking forward to this opportunity. "I'd love to send you occasional stories for editing as a way to introduce you to the publishing world," Dr. Ackerman said. Barnum published my essay under a different title that December, generating a mix of approval and disagreement. Dr. Ackerman later informed me that it was a success, and some of her students were debating it. One even went so far as to call me a fatuous nobody. I assured her that wasn't the kind of criticism we encouraged. "Thanks for defending me," I replied, amused by the comment. ISA discovered my essay on Barnum's website and emailed me, saying, "Mom and Dad are impressed that you're finally doing something they understand and making some money. Precious little so far, but I may have a real editing job soon, fingers crossed." I took my new role seriously, providing feedback and critiques to aspiring authors. Dr. Ackerman had access to their papers either through class or a publisher. I served as the editor who could provide unbiased critiques, which they wouldn't recognize each time. Every time I received feedback from Dr. Ackerman, I felt overwhelmed. After several rounds of criticism, I took her words to heart and eventually expressed my concerns. She replied with a long email explaining that she was building a new kind of business and wanted me to be part of it. She acknowledged the difficulties of criticism, noting that every author faces similar challenges, but encouraged me by saying, "I have big plans for you if you stick with it. I'm pleased with your progress." I learned that good writing was demanding, it required effort and didn't always guarantee success. As Jill's time at Quantico was wrapping up, I attended the Wake Forest Symposium for Writers, which featured a packed schedule of meetings and discussions. I presented lectures on To Kill a Mockingbird and James Jones's war novels, offering feedback on various one-page essays from authors, mostly my peers or slightly older. "How old are you, Kyle?" Dr. Orman asked. 25, I replied. She paused before saying, I think that'll work." Dr. Murray was impressed with my lecture on Jones, and Dr. Ackerman informed me of that. "I don't remember Murray," I said. "I lectured 15 men and 1 young woman, and they critiqued every statement. It felt like another kind of trial." "She's a woman," Dr. Ackerman said, her eyes sparkling. Startled, I realized my disbelief. "She's a PhD. How old could she be?" I wondered aloud, recalling that it was unusual for a girl to show interest in war novels. "She's 22, a close family friend of mine." "Brilliant," Dr. Ackerman replied. "The only thing holding her back is that she needs more time to read more literature. She graduated 2 months ago from UNCC." Surprised, I replied, "She seems so young." Dr. Ackerman laughed. "You'll get used to her. I want her to work with you in a few months." As I progressed in my field, my role quickly expanded. Sharon Ackerman, though a large presence, moved swiftly and gracefully as she developed her company. Dr. Murray and I became co-workers online, and I grew to enjoy our discussions. "I intend for you to take over for me someday," Sharon told me. "Not anytime soon, I hope," I replied. She smiled. "Kyle, you're 28. You've built this company into your early career. We now have 9 other editors. Professional Publications Underwriters is thriving, but my health isn't improving, and my husband insists I slow down. I'd like you to take over most of my supervisory duties in the next 2 years. You'll manage senior editors, which will reduce the number of authors you edit directly, but you'll ensure the company stays on track." "What about Emo and Nelson?" I asked. "Nelson is too set in his ways. He tends to avoid difficult conversations with authors, letting them linger without accepting necessary changes. Emo isn't ready yet. She's 25 but still has a youthful appearance, and she doesn't yet have the experience needed to navigate certain social situations." Sharon had asked me to select her for this reason. It was easy to underestimate Emo because of her age, yet she possessed a talent that few others do. Her writing was not just impressive, I believed she had the potential to write a great novel someday. We talked weekly by phone and texted often as we discussed manuscripts and editing. Some days, we even met in chat to share insights. "Emo is special," I said. "I've known her for 3 years now, but only within our professional context. She hasn't confided in me much." Sharon nodded thoughtfully. Emo had lived with her during college, and they shared a close relationship that resembled a mother-daughter dynamic. Sharon had strong ties to her own parents, who were both academics. "Remember how I had you handle the Smith situation?" she asked. I recalled it well. Just 2 months earlier, Barb Smith had submitted a fairly good novel about the Civil War. Sharon had assigned it to one of our female editors, Nancy Willensong. Nancy, in her late 30s, was attractive and married with 3 children. Unfortunately, Barb and Nancy became involved in a secret relationship, leading to legal issues when Nancy's husband discovered them. I was tasked with managing the fallout and ultimately fired Nancy for breaching her confidentiality agreement. We canceled Barb's contract, and since the meetings were consensual, the lawsuit was dropped. We changed our policy after that, forbidding personal chats with clients and requiring approval for any physical interactions, Sharon explained. "Our anonymity protects us." The only time I met Barb Smith was at Zinger Publishing when I visited to explain the termination. I wasn't sure if her book had been published after that incident. "Sometimes you have to be firm," Sharon said. "Emo is still learning when to take a stand. She's the first to acknowledge that her youth and appearance might not always work in her favor." "I hate to see you cutting back, Sharon," I said, "but I look forward to the job. Will I have acquisition authority? I'd like to choose which projects to work on." "Yes, absolutely. That's why I've been sending you so many manuscripts to assign to editors. You've made great decisions each time, and now you'll get paid for it. But remember, I still own the company, so don't mess it up." She smiled, though I sensed a seriousness behind her words. "I've been preparing you for this," she continued. "You know all but the last 2 editors I hired, and you'll meet them at the next company meeting. Everyone we work with knows you and supports your promotion as my successor." I was slightly surprised that she had already mentioned me to our associates. I know I'm young for such a position in a growing company, and I appreciate your faith in me, I said. Sharon seemed hesitant. Emo could become your ally. I know you two would make a great team. I nodded, recognizing her wisdom. I had always found Emo insightful, especially when she advised a colleague to revise the climax of his novel into a flashback at the end. He had been struggling to complete his book, and her suggestion proved to be a brilliant move. The book received several nominations, and he was being courted by major publishers. I hoped he'd stay with Zinger and Us, but their contract was only for that one book. Zinger had hired us to edit Kudnick's work. Emo was such a unique talent, we didn't want to overlook her. I mentioned that all the authors enjoyed working with her, although a couple refused to take any advice, which usually resulted in them being transferred to me. Do you think she'd be interested in a troubleshooting role? You know how we're dealing with some difficult authors, I suggested. She's very good at calming them down. I think they're surprised to learn she has a PhD and some authority. Her background might lead them to underestimate her. She has a knack for persuading someone who has spent years on a project to reconsider fundamental aspects of it. I think she might like it, unless it's always a challenging situation, Sharon replied, looking me directly in the eye. It was clear she wanted me to manage some of those tougher cases. What kind of family life does she have? I see her at these workshops a few times a year, but we usually stick to work-related topics. I literally know nothing about her, I admitted. Sharon smiled. You know her parents and I go way back. Her dad teaches music and coaches voice, while her mom is a psychology professor. Given her advanced academic abilities, she's sacrificed much of the typical social experience, no prom, no baseball games. She paused, reflecting. She's been so focused on reading, writing, and her degrees that she hasn't had much opportunity for social growth. It's only with our company that she's begun to come into her own. She really has a talent for working with people. Sharon continued, Emo spent her adolescence living with my husband and me, going to school with older peers. Her parents mention she hasn't had a boyfriend, and when they ask her, she just says she's too busy with work. No girlfriend either. She has her own apartment, a cat, and a car. She goes to church and has some commitments there. I sensed that Sharon wanted to share more but held back, as if she had something significant to say. Do you mind if I talk to her about her goals and aspirations? She's too talented to be hidden away in an office. Be my guest, Sharon encouraged. We want to keep her. I don't think she wants to move on, at least not yet. I mentioned that while I talked to Emo frequently, she kept our conversations strictly business. Whenever I asked about her family or personal life, she'd shake her head or steer the conversation back to work. Sharon laughed, nodding knowingly. That may change over time. Emo and I talk about more than just work. 2 hours later, after Emo finished with her small group critique, I met her outside the room. Lunch? I'd like to talk, I said. I'd love to, she replied. In all the years we'd worked together, I had probably only shared a meal with her during group discussions or work-related talks. It had never been just the two of us as friends. She seemed genuinely happy to have lunch together. Her youthful appearance was striking, and I could see how some men might be drawn to her. As we sat down and ordered, I updated her on the general changes coming at PPU. She wasn't surprised or anxious, just pleased to be included. She didn't seem jealous of my position, which I appreciated. I shared that Sharon had asked me to be the managing senior editor, and Emo smiled, congratulating me with genuine happiness. I hope you'll keep me on, she said. I've really enjoyed the way this company operates. Of course, I replied. You're our best editor, Emo, and you handle people exceptionally well. I'd like you to take on some of the tasks I've had, I said, letting the moment settle. Emo held her coffee on the table and looked at me, clearly wanting to speak. I'd seen that look before when she had an idea to discuss. Tell me about Jill, she said, surprising me with the change of topic. It felt personal, and I wondered why she was steering the conversation this way. It seemed everything Emo did had a purpose behind it. Growing up with her was unique, I began. I never really had to choose a girlfriend. I had one since I was 7, and I'm still with her. We played games, talked about our hopes for the future. I grew up in Ohio, and I have fond memories of my childhood. Emo listened intently, sipping her Coke, looking pensive. Jill sounds like a remarkable person. I met her gaze and noticed something in her eyes. What about your life? I asked. Do you have a boyfriend? No, not really, she replied, and I realized there was more behind her words. Her eyes held a depth that suggested she understood more than she let on. Don't be coy, I said. I know you're grown up, even if you look youthful. She smiled, and the atmosphere shifted. You finally understand, don't you? She said softly. I haven't had many boyfriends, I've turned down a few. If someone comes along who measures up, I'll let you know, but you're a tough act to follow. I kept my focus on her, reflecting on our time together. I love my wife, I stated. Jill is in Okinawa for a few more months. Emo's expression softened. I'm not trying to come between you and your wife. I want you to love her. I don't want a man who doesn't love his wife. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because others can sense how I feel. I spoke with my mom about you months ago, and she mentioned it to Dr. Ackerman, who guessed my feelings long ago. She smiled at the memory. Will this change things for you? I don't know, I replied. I like that you keep a respectful distance from other men. I discourage advances, she admitted, her laughter brightening the mood. There was this one woman at a conference who tried to make a move on you. I found it amusing. I hope you find someone, Emo, I said. Do you know why I'm so small? She asked suddenly, catching me off guard. I just assumed it was genetic, I said. It is, but it's a condition related to my pituitary gland. I stopped growing at 12. They treated it, and I grew a little more, but I still look quite young. Why share this with me? I asked. Because it's the only secret I have. Dr. Orman knows, my parents know. Anyone who looks at me might suspect something. But I know you love your wife. We fell into silence for a moment. Would it be awkward around her? I finally asked. Apart from your wife's family, you're my closest friend. I'm glad you told me how you feel. I hope it doesn't change things, I said, but if you need something to change, just let me know. Emo shook her head with a smile. I'm not unhappy. I love the work and enjoy seeing you a few times a year. Having your attention, even just for work, is nice. This is really the first time we've talked outside of business, she said. My mom mentioned that working together can sometimes lead to deeper feelings. I was taken aback by her use of the word love, and I sensed it wasn't a new realization for her. She had likely contemplated this for some time. I don't want to feel unrequited, she added. But until I find that kind of connection with someone else, I prefer being around you. After a moment, she smiled. Maybe I'll convince you that the thin red line is an allegory. I laughed, unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. When I spoke to Jill later, I mentioned my conversation with Emo. Some guys make passes at me in the core, Jill said. I don't go out with anyone individually, only in groups, and I make it clear I'm married. Emo isn't making a pass, she just hopes to find someone like me, I said. Jill remained quiet, and I thought about how young she looked. Our long separations due to her work in Okinawa meant I only saw her a few times a year. During that time, I edited numerous books, and PPU thrived. Emo and I maintained our internet friendship, enjoying our work exchanges but not discussing personal matters much. PPU was growing. We nurtured writers, and publishers appreciated our efforts. We occasionally had to inform authors that their work wasn't suitable, which publishers often welcomed. Kudnick's book, for instance, flourished after Emo suggested he reorganize it. As we gained success, I took on more of Sharon's responsibilities, liaising with publishers and agents. Emo became a trusted support for other editors, and her presence eased the tension many felt in the industry. One Tuesday evening before Jill's deployment leave, I attended a meeting with Sharon and the president of Zinger Publishing. We discussed merging editorial functions, and I was set to become the editor-in-chief. I was excited about the opportunity but knew it would require relocating temporarily. That day was eventful for both Jill and me. We each held secrets that stirred our emotions. I planned to share my news with her, while she kept hers private. But life took an unexpected turn when I learned of Jill's passing. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your likes.